Okay, thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. Okay, then. So let's get started. And we'd like to get started this seminar with webinar with let's say an example from the past. Actually, we are talking about the 70s, 50 years ago, when video recorders started being commercialized for homes as home appliances. And by then there were mainly two standards, VHS and Betamax. And Betamax is said, or so I was told at the university, is said to be superior. It was superior with respect to, let's say, video quality and other cassette size and so on and so forth. And let's say Betamax was developed by Sony. And by then in Japan, the Ministry of Technology was pushing for, let's say, a single standard to be put in the market. And Sony convinced the ministry to adopt Betamax. But then what happened was that JVC formed an alliance with Matsushita, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, Sharp, and other companies in order to back the other standard, the VHS. One of the main issues there was that Sony had held the copyright on Betamax, the rights on Betamax, and it was, let's say, about willing to sell licenses and rights. So that's one of the reasons JVC and these other companies pushed for a different standard. And at the end, some of you may know, some other will probably hear this story for the first time, especially younger people. At the end, VHS ended up to be the standard adopted. The Ministry of Technology changed its mind and pushed by these companies, let's say, moved toward the other standard. And VHS at the end, let's say, although inferior in performances and quality, replaced Betamax. So why am I starting this, let's say, seminar with this story? Well, I guess you guessed it. The point is that as a technician and as a, let's say, developer, I often look at projects as a technical problem, as something we need to solve from the technical point to deliver the best solution. Well, this example shows it is not so simple. And it is not just, let's say, the technical solution which can make the difference between success and failure in a project. All conditions being, let's say, the same, like cost, quality, and timing. And this is a case in which stakeholders, and in particular competitors of Sony, actually managed to, let's say, change a project outcome from a desired one, namely Betamax being put as the only standard in the market, to, of course, an undesirable one. And so the example shows that stakeholders are important, are extremely important in, let's say, project management. And in fact, let's say, when preparing these slides, I had a look at the history of the project management body of knowledge and the role stakeholders have throughout the different editions. So, and it so happens that stakeholders were set from the very start, the first edition in 1996, as a central point in any project. And more specifically, the first edition defines the project manager goals as meeting or exceeding stakeholders' expectations. So by then it was all focused on people. I might be exaggerating a bit, of course, for the sake of the presentation, but then again, let's say, I guess you are getting my point. Then, as things moved along on the third edition, closed captioning. Yeah, let me see whether I can enable closed captioning. Just hold on a second, because I'm not very confident with the presentation. I need the panels, meeting info. Afraid I'm not to do that. Okay, so if anyone knows how to enable closed captioning, if they write it on the chat, I'll be more happy to enable it. Anyhow, to go back to our presentation, the third edition put more emphasis on processes, but then on the fifth edition, and we're talking about 2013 now, stakeholder management moved from being part of the communication knowledge area to becoming its own knowledge area. And this is a sign of the importance, let's say, stakeholders have. And recently, last year, the 7th edition, which was quite a radical change with respect to, let's say, the previous editions, focused on value delivery and emphasized once again that projects are performed by people for people. So, okay, so if we, let's say, focus on people, if we focus on stakeholders, then things are relatively easy, are they not? And just to put a negative example, taken from, let's say, the link you see on the bottom of the slide, I can show you the example of the Coca-Cola company, which in the 80s, 85, tried to, let's say, change their iconic Coke. And they developed a new product. They changed the recipes. They tested it on 200,000 people. And the results were that people preferred it over the traditional way. So it seemed like a very logical decision to change, or let's say to put into the market this new brand, this new Coke, because it would have a market. However, it ended up that, let's say, other factors kicked in, such as product loyalty and habits. And people didn't buy the new Coke as expected. So, and that had a massive impact on the company. So the data I got from the website is that $4 million US dollars were lost were used for developing the new product, and at the end, the Coca-Cola company ended up losing another $30 million in back-stocked products, which didn't get into the market. So stakeholders are important. Stakeholders can make the difference between success and failure of a project. So what can we do then? And what I'm going to claim and say in this talk is that, let's say, what we can do is to put together a combination of management skills, project management skills. And on the one hand, I would like to focus on the hard skills. I'm abusing the terms a bit here, but let's say the first thing is focusing on the hard skills, that is the measurable and controllable. What is measurable and controllable? The processes and tools you can use in order to, let's say, improve and standardize and control the stakeholder management process. But this is not enough, in my opinion. And what you need to add on top of it is what I called here the soft skills. Well, in a sense, is more in the, let's say, parts of the project manager, in the skills maybe acquired over time and which are maybe difficult to teach with front-end lessons, namely the capability of understanding stakeholders' needs, expectations, and winning conditions. And in my opinion, only if you put together these two capabilities, these two kind of skills, then you can end up with a successful project. So let me first focus on the hard skills, on the part which is easier to present and easier to, let's say, reason about. And well, of course, we need to start from the definition. Nothing, let's say, surprising here, maybe, and especially because I'm, let's say, resorting to the PMBOK definition, and by which a project stakeholder is an individual or an organization that is actively involved in a project or whose interest may be affected as a result of project execution or completion. So anyone which, in a sense, is around the perimeter of our project and who or which may be affected by project outcome. And just to, let's say, add maybe a few obvious remarks about, let's say, the definition. Well, the first is that all projects have at least one stakeholder. And this is important because, in a sense, it demonstrates, let's say, it is a case for the importance and necessity of stakeholder management. Of course, the number of stakeholders may vary from project to project, number and kind of stakeholders, ranging from the very small to the extremely huge and big projects. And there are different degrees of separation, different degrees of, let's say, distance you may have in your stakeholders. One common classification distinguishes between internal and external stakeholders, meaning by these the stakeholder which are within the project and the organization from the stakeholders which are in a sense only marginally touched by the project or outside the organization. And the final point to highlight is that the project team and the project manager are stakeholders, which is on the one hand a proof of the first point here, that all projects have at least one stakeholder. But on the other, it highlights the importance of team management and let's say, of ensuring that projects provide outcomes which are of value for the project manager, but also, maybe more important, for the project team involved in the project. Today, however, we will mainly focus on what I called here the external stakeholder. And okay, and then let's say, just to provide some example, I have put here different examples of projects from the very small to the bigger, and which may start from, let's say, a decoration project at home in which the number of stakeholders is very, very limited, to, let's say, through the development of a software system to support operations in a company, in which stakeholders start to increase because not only do you have the project team, which is also beneficiary of the project, but you also have all the people in the organization, and maybe also some competitors developing a system similar to the one you are installing in your organization. And then we can move on to the development of a off-the-shelf software system, which you are going to sell, which further increases the number of stakeholders and types of stakeholders, maybe to, once again, competition, but also maybe suppliers rather than regulators, according to the kind of software you are developing. Or maybe it could be the installation of the gasifier in Piombino, something we are talking about here in Italy after we started changing our supply flows of natural gas, which of course involves a larger number of stakeholders, such as, let's say, the local community, and which may be impacted positively or negatively by the project, because, for instance, of the environmental impact, rather than the number of jobs will be created. And finally, the last example I thought, which let's say ended up with a question which we'll try to answer together at the end of the webinar, is the setup of a whale reservoir in the Ligurian Sea. So a place where, let's say, navigation is prohibited in order to, let's say, save the small whales which live in the Ligurian Sea. And then, of course, this is an interesting example because it makes you wonder whether whales themselves may be stakeholders or not. In a sense, they are going to be positively affected by the project. So the question I'm posing and making to you is, so whether they count as stakeholders, and then we will try and answer at the end of the project. Half a joke, half serious, but it might be, let's say, some interesting thing to think about. Okay, some other maybe obvious but important remarks. So the stakeholders may have different influence and varying levels of responsibility during the project. So the process of managing your stakeholders will have to be dynamic. It doesn't mean cannot be static. It is something you need to, let's say, keep performing throughout the project. They may change roles, so their influence and their impact in the project may change over time, and their intervention or lack of may influence the project in a positive or in a negative way. And this, once again, highlights the importance of a sound, let's say, management of stakeholders and a sound, let's say, feedback collection from stakeholders. Another point is that they may be difficult to identify. So there are some situations in which, let's say, it is not fully clear the extent of all the stakeholders you are going to impact with your project, and therefore the kind of, let's say, of attention you need to pay to certain groups of people. Sorry. Okay. And of course, they may change also their opinion over time. So, so that's the reason. The PMBOK defines the stakeholder performance domain, and which comprises all the activities and functions which are associated with managing stakeholders in the project. And let's say a successful management of the stakeholders basically can help you achieve 3 goals. Well, the first is that of, let's say, setting up a productive working relationship throughout the project, which simplifies things quite a bit. I guess all of you have been involved in managing projects. I guess most, if not all of you, have been involved in projects in which one or more stakeholders constituted an issue and an obstacle to the achievement of certain project results. So the other point is that it helps you agree on the project objective. And this is one, let's say, I would say, very deep and profound issue in software development, because if you think about it, and if you have some experience there, most of, let's say, the software processes which have been defined over time have all focused on, let's say, ensuring that you develop the right thing, to develop the, let's say, software your customer really is asking for and needing. And the third point is that, that ensuring that, let's say, you create win-win conditions, so that, let's say, the project stakeholders who are positively backing you, in a sense, benefit from the project outputs and outcomes. And while, of course, you keep in control the influence and of the project stakeholders who may negatively impact on your project. So the stakeholder performance domain is organized in the PMBOK in 6 different steps. The first 4 steps are really about planning, I would say, whereas the last 2 steps are about execution and monitoring. So they are identification, understanding, analysis, prioritization with respect to planning, and engaging and monitoring with respect to the execution phase. And let's say these steps are meant to be performed in sequence, but they are also meant to be cyclical, to be performed in cycles, repeated over and over again, so that, let's say, throughout the project execution, you have an update view of, let's say, your stakeholders. Okay, let's get into a bit more details about the first steps, namely identification and understanding and identifying, understanding, and analyzing, which have the goals, well, very well represented by their, let's say, their definition. Namely, the first is understanding who is going to be impacted or who has an influence on the project with respect to identification. But then, let's say this is not enough. You also need to, let's say, create a picture, understand, let's say, what the stakeholders, who the stakeholders are. In a sense, what are their feelings, their beliefs, their values. You want to, in a sense, get a picture of the people and organizations you are dealing with in your project, in order to better define the strategies and, let's say, the ways in which you can interact and manage them throughout the project. And the third point is analyzing the stakeholders with respect to the impact they can have or on your project. So some, let's say, dimensions which are usually measured include power, the kind of power the stakeholders have, the kind of influence they can exert on your project, and the degree of influence they are going to exert. The proximity to you and your project, the kind of interest they have, because these things change the attention you need to pay to the different stakeholders. There are some, let's say, simple tools you can use in order to perform these 3 steps. One simple tool is for the identification is using a mind map in which, let's say, you can use different strategies for, let's say, your identification. You can start from, let's say, stakeholder types. For instance, here I have started from distinguishing internal stakeholders from external stakeholders. And then, let's say, I further refine into finer grained representations, such as the project team, the senior management responsible for the approval of the project. And let's say if you're working in a large organization, and this is not the case for me anymore, but if you're working in a large organization, the peers, let's say the project management office, other teams are other stakeholders, which might try to exert a positive or in some cases a negative influence on your project, as it is the case when you are working in an environment with limited resources and teams are competing to, let's say, get the resources to finish their project. Not a healthy, let's say, organizational culture, but a culture which nevertheless happens in practice, at least in my experience. And let's say you can end up the process, in my opinion, you can end the process when you arrive at when you can name actually your stakeholder. So in the case of the project team, I started, let's say, naming them, because the more specific you are, the better. In some other cases, you may not start. In some other cases, you maybe are starting this process before all individuals and names are clear. But then again, let's say, in that case, what you need to do, you need to start with some generic, let's say, identification of your stakeholders, maybe by type, with some generic management strategies. And as you get to know your stakeholders better, then your strategies will become clearer and better instantiated. With respect to the external stakeholders, a common, let's say, representation distinguishes, a common classification distinguishes between clients, competitors, regulators, suppliers, the public in general, and interest groups, which might be difficult to handle in various projects. I was involved in the development of an e-voting machine in my previous job at Fondazione Bruno Kessler, and you can imagine the kind of interest groups we had to deal with. The project was sponsored by the autonomous province of Trento, and it ended up with the largest experimentation of e-voting in Italy, and with an e-voting election performed with legal value in Friuli, Venezia Giulia. In the US, I know that, let's say, voting is a common practice. Here in Italy, there is a lot of resistance, and in fact, during the project, we had to deal with various, let's say, groups which had concerns about the introduction of technologies in the poll, and we had to set up a specific communication campaign and specific communication activities targeting these interest groups in order to clarify and to, let's say, pinpoint why the technology was safe and better than the paper ballot. But let's say one important remark was not only, let's say, telling, it was also, let's say, getting feedback and receiving information. But we will get back to that later on in the presentation. Another representation you can use is what they call the onion. In my case, it's a square poached onion. And in this case, what you can do is to, let's say, highlight the distance, so to speak, of the different stakeholders from your from your project. So the inner core is represented by the project manager and the team, and then maybe in the next layer you have the project sponsors and the organization, your organization. And then as you move, let's say, to the outer layers, you may have other stakeholders, such as the suppliers, the clients, the competitors, public, and so on and so forth. Whatever tool you use, the important thing is that you come out with an exhaustive, the best list you can build about, let's say, your specific stakeholder. Once you have your stakeholders, and then you have analyzed their needs, their once you have your stakeholder, then the next step is that of, let's say, prioritizing them, defining which stakeholders are more interesting for you and for your project. And one common representation here is very similar to the SWOT analysis. So you have two dimensions. On one dimension, maybe the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you represent the interest of your stakeholders from low to high, and on the vertical axis, maybe you represent the power of the stakeholders, distinguishing between two, let's say, from low to high. And then what you can do, you can put all your different stakeholders you have identified in the different boxes. So maybe you may have a sponsor which has a high power. In fact, they can cancel your project. And maybe an high interest in, and hopefully an high interest in sponsoring your project. Or and you may have a team which is not very well motivated. So you put it on the, let's say, on the left, upper left box, because it is not very well motivated, but of course it has got a high influence on your project execution. And maybe you may have interest groups, once again, which might have a high interest on your project, but maybe lower power. Why do we put, what is the purpose of doing this exercise? The purpose of doing this exercise is setting up priority, defining which are the stakeholders which are more important for you to, let's say, analyze and monitor. And of course, you may guess that, let's say, the upper right most box is the one which requires the most attention, while, let's say, the box here on the lower left is going to be the one with the stakeholders which require less energy on your side, and the guys here something in between. Matter of fact, there is a standard way of, let's say, defining a management strategy for the stakeholders when you are using a power interest grid, which is that of, let's say, manage closely the stakeholders which require which have the most influence and the highest the most interest and the highest power on your project. You want to keep satisfied the stakeholders who have a high power and maybe a low interest on your project, whereas as the power diminishes, then so does the kind of, let's say, buy-ins, the kind of effort you put and the kind of, let's say, requirements you need to satisfy. You want to, let's say, you can spend a minimum effort on the stakeholder who have a low interest and low power on your project, while you may be willing to keep, let's say, the stakeholders with a high interest and low power. You may want to keep them informed. in the case of, let's say, the voting project, the interest group I was telling you about, were between this box and, let's say, and this box here, somewhere between the two boxes. Okay. Of course, if you are the graphical type, you probably like all these diagrams and so on and so forth. But let's say there is an easier representation, which is a tabular one. You use a table, a spreadsheet, and in which you list all your different stakeholders. And if you look on the internet, there are many, many different standards. I have just put 3 of them here just to give you the idea of how many there are. But let's say my suggestion is that of, let's say, defining at least this information, and then add the one you reckon it is important for you as well. So, of course, you want to make sure that for each stakeholder, you record the interest and the power, the influence they have in the project. And you can do that using, let's say, a qualitative scale like low-high, low-high. The low-high we use for interest and influence in the power interest grid. You want to, let's say, then, however, you also want to provide a narrative description of the influence you perceive the stakeholders may have on your project. So, and that goes both ways. It goes one way from the project to the stakeholder in the sense of the kind of impact your project may have on the stakeholder, but also the other way around, kind of, let's say, positive or negative influence the stakeholder may have on your project. And this information allows you to start defining a management strategy, which is, let's say, basically defining the way in which you ensure you maximize the influence of the positive stakeholders and you minimize the risk posed by people who are not so in line with your project objective. And then, of course, according to how big your project is, you may be willing to add more information, such as the person responsible for, let's say, carrying out the management of the stakeholder, and maybe a timing for, let's say, interacting, a schedule and the timing for interacting with the stakeholder, and so on and so forth. But this is really up to your project and you. In my opinion and in my experience, that let's say the first 4 items are the ones which are the most important to track, and which are, let's say, applicable to all projects. Okay, so once you define your, let's say, management strategy, you need to start engaging your project. You move, in a sense, from the planning phase to the execution phase, and you need to ensure that you apply your management strategy. So this is what the PMBOK calls stakeholder engagement, and it is the process of engaging and keeping the stakeholders involved. And basically, the main tool you have here is communication. So defining a good communication and interaction plan, which allows you to specify the time, the frequency with which you will interact with your stakeholders, the methods you will use, and the types of communication you will use with each different stakeholder or stakeholder type. You have other tools, of course. You can also promote and this participation, and you can, let's say, and of course you can also do, let's say, what you need to do as a project manager, not only in stakeholder management, but also in other activities, such as removing obstacles and barriers to ensure that, let's say, stakeholders get the maximum benefit for your project. I want to spend another few words about, let's say, the second point here, promoting and easing participation, because here one thing you can try and do is try to actively involve the stakeholders, even the negative ones, in your project, in order to try and, let's say, buy them in. Once again, in the case of the voting project we worked on, we involved the interest group in trying and testing the machines in interactive sessions in which they would pose us questions and we would answer them to try and see whether there were risks associated to e-voting, the kind of, let's say, architecture we were using, and so on and so forth. And this ended up to be extremely productive for us, because not only did we manage to build a system, not only did we manage to build trust into the system, but we also managed to incorporate some of, let's say, the suggestions or some of the, let's say, doubts into our communication campaign and into our systems. Concerning communication, as I was saying, there are three things you need to take into account. So in order to, let's say, execute your, to ensure a proper engagement, one thing you need to take into account is the timing. So deciding who receives the information and when, and let's say the timing, the formal timing, in my experience, is what gets integrated into your Gantt chart or whatever tool you use for planning your project. It is what I call the more formal part of the project. It may include, let's say, it may be integrated with milestones, maybe, rather than, let's say, specific meetings and events, such as the kickoff meeting or a press release to publicize project start or project results or the launch of a product. Because, let's say, of course, you have this formal timing, and then you have other interactions which, in my experience, happen more for the continuous attention and stimulus of the project manager rather than for let's say, following a written plan in which you say, okay, every 3 days I want to hear from Alfred what is going on. Okay, you need to set up timings, you need to set up methods, and the methods define how the information is going to flow in your project. There are basically three different, let's say, possibilities. You can either push the information, and this is the model in which you, let's say, send the information to the stakeholders in various forms. It could be memos, emails, and so on and so forth. It is in a simple, I have written here it is low cost. It is not necessarily low cost. It certainly requires attention because if you are using a push model, then you need to prepare in advance for the fact that you're not receiving a direct feedback on what you are pushing, on the information you are pushing. So you need to, let's say, be a bit careful here. You can pull the information. You can pull information if you, and this happens, for instance, if you look for information from various sources to sense stakeholders' concerns. or you can have an interactive session, interactive, let's say, exchanges in which you have an active exchange with your stakeholders, with feedback loops. And this is, in my experience, let's say, you need to use all three of them. In my experience, this is the most rewarding and the most interesting, and also the one from which you can get the most. And of course, you can use different communication types, which define the level of formality you are using to push your information or to exchange your information with your stakeholders. It could be verbal, it could be written. In both cases, you may have formal and informal, let's say, communications. And for instance, according to whether you decide to use presentation and formal reviews rather than, let's say, having a chat at the coffee machine or so on and so forth. But this is something that I believe you are all aware of. Okay, some notes about the communication, something very important to remind, even though this is also maybe clear to many of you, or to all of you, that there is a big difference between, you need to pay a lot of attention between, let's say, what you intend to say, what you are actually saying, and what, let's say, and how what you're saying is perceived by your interlocutor, the person you are speaking with. Because of course, if you always keep in mind, let's say, this difference between the mental models you have and the mental model the person you are speaking or communicating with has, helps you deal with a lot of, let's say, conflicts and a lot of misunderstandings in your communication. And the process, once again, also in this case, is interactive, in the sense that the conversation goes back and forth if it is, let's say, interactive. And as you move along the conversation, your mental models and the mental models of the person you're speaking with are changing. And hopefully, if you're conducting a good conversation, then, let's say, your mental models will converge to the same line, on the same line. And finally, just let's say, to complete on the formal part, there is the monitoring. And the monitoring is a process in which you understand whether your stakeholder management plan is working. And in my opinion, there are three things you want to look for. The first is whether there are unmet expectations. So you want to check whether you are meeting the expectations of the stakeholders as you agreed upon. And if not, you take the appropriate measures to, let's say, to change. Here, it is important to, let's say, have interactive feedbacks, interactive communication. You want to, let's say, tell, but you also want to listen. You want to ensure your communication plan is being executed as planned in an effective way, and you want to make sure the information is reaching in a timely and effective manner. And you can ask whether there are stakeholders which are left behind, who are not informed about progress, and so on and so forth. And this is an extremely important, let's say, area, because even if you look at all the tools that there are in order to synchronize and support, let's say, communication in the team, then you realize how difficult this task is. And then, of course, you want to check whether there are variations in your plan, in the stakeholders, in the project environment, in their goals and so on. Okay, so I spent quite some time describing the process and I left behind all the soft skills, what I call the soft skills. So what are the soft skills then in this process and how we use them? And my proposal, the way in which my experience, I would say, is that they help you define some healthy checks on your plan. So, well, the first is playing a bit with words, is that, let's say, you use your comprehension, your feeling about the stakeholders you interact with to make sure that first, you understand, meaning by this, that you understand the expectations of most, possibly all your. Then, equally more important, in my opinion, is that you are aware of what you don't know. So you are aware of the fact that the goals of some of your stakeholders might not be yet clear to you, because these allow you to set, let's say, more monitoring activities, and let's say shape your communication, the way in which you communicate with your stakeholders, the way in which you understand, let's say, your stakeholder. And finally, of course, there is the known, the unknown, and there are the unknown unknowns. So in a sense, the third point is that you know that you don't know what you really don't know. So you rely on your plan, but you are ready to monitor and react should the need arise. So you acknowledge the fact that, let's say, there are some things you cannot plan in advance and that you need to react to when they occur. Second thing, the soft skills help you, let's say, define some healthy checks on your plan. Meaning by, and the two things I want to highlight here is that you are able to identify for each stakeholder the buy-ins. Meaning by this that, let's say, you understand what are the winning conditions of your stakeholders, what makes your stakeholders stick, what motivates your stakeholders. And in order to, let's say, understand this, you need to know what are the values and principles of your stakeholders, what is their work culture. And because this allows you to define what I call the exchange currency you have in your project in order to, let's say, define also some compromises, some, let's say, something you may be willing to offer in your project in order to, let's say, buy the support of one stakeholder. So on the one hand, there are the buy-ins. On the other, there are the hidden agendas. Not all the stakeholders are plain and clear, and some have their own agendas. And let's say you need to use your skills in order, in the first place, to, let's say, well, understand whom you trust and whom you want to pay more attention to. But let's say, and in order to do so, you need to understand what are the interests of their stakeholders and how these interests may be affected by the project outcome. Going back to the internal competition, let's say, example, in situations in which an organization has limited resources, it might as well be that, let's say, one team in parallel to yours will not, say, actively work to have your project succeed. And you need to be aware of that and take the appropriate, let's say, countermeasures and understand, let's say, whether you can create a win-win condition by changing some of the, let's say, your project hypothesis. And And so that at the end you can understand whether there is a way to align the project goals and their impact. But all of these, at the end, it amounts to, let's say, one main message to give, which is that of, let's say, giving and putting your project management, stakeholder management plan enough space for listening. This is something very difficult to do because we are so convinced with our ideas, we are so opinionated, and if, let's say, a project manager was not opinionated, then someone would argue that it would be more difficult to manage a project. You need to be, let's say, sure and opinionated about the project's success. Otherwise, you let's say, don't even start managing it. Still raising the possibility of some doubts, raising the opening the space for listening is important. It's important in various respects because it can help you understand the requirements and needs of your stakeholder. It can help you understand their winning condition. It can make you stronger in the specific domain of your project. And in my experience, if you have enough strength to, let's say, demonstrate empathy and the patience, the openness which is required for listening, then you can buy the respect of your stakeholders. And I know that all these things are maybe difficult, especially in a situation in which you are stressed to achieve results because of timing is tight, budget is tight. Let's say, taking the time and having the time to, let's say, be patient and listen to someone coming to you complaining about, let's say, something which you think might be minor, then requires some deliberate effort. Deliberate effort which we made for BringTheFood. This is the second example I want to, let's say, talk about, which is related to the application we are developing for recovering surplus food, BringTheFood. And the initial idea was developed, more than 10 years ago now. It was in 2012. And it came out of an idea in the lab. And we built the first version, and we got a lot of attention from the media, then the Italian media. And we went in the wild, and we didn't manage to make any number. And the reason we didn't manage to make any number was that basically the idea was built in the lab. We didn't take into, let's say, proper attention and proper focus the real need of the operators in the sector, the surplus, the charities collecting surplus food. And it took us quite some time to realize that. So we need to move to 2015 in order to, let's say, start rebuilding our application from scratch. And it took us some time, quite some time, because in a sense, we had the visibility of the media. We were very opinionated about what the technology could do to help recover surplus food, and so on and so forth. But it was when we started talking with the charities, we started spending time to, let's say, listen to the fact that we were not building the right product, that we were doing the things wrong, that, let's say, we were doing the wrong things. It was then that we started, let's say, building an application which is now helping recovering 1,200 tons of food every year and growing. And the process has been very important because, as I was mentioning earlier, not only did we manage to build an application which is actually working now, but we also managed to gain the trust of the charities we are working with. We managed to gain, let's say, a successful partnership, which is strong and growing, and which is helping us, let's say, grow better. And least but not last, we also managed to, by starting listening to different charities, we started incorporating different best practices in the application. And now BringTheFood is an application which not only helps recover food, but it is also a web app which helps share best practices defined by the charities and implemented in the application. Something which we would have never achieved if, let's say, we didn't put an explicit effort in, let's say, listening to our partner. Okay, I have spoken enough, I believe, and put a lot of maybe information, I hope, useful information, I hope. I want to conclude this presentation with 2 slides. The first is taken from the Atlassian website, a blog, which basically, in my opinion, recaps very well some of the topics we touched today. Namely, the fact that stakeholder management is about empowering people so that they can function at their best. And I want to add to that, let's say, in order to do so, you need to set up an environment which allows people to come and speak to you and provide any feedback. And of course, all the hard skill stuff, hard work up front is the one that gets you prepared and make sure everything works smoothly. Okay, conclusions. So just to recap, so, well, managing projects is about managing people and their expectations. And when managing people and expectations, you may end up with positive and negative influences in your project. You want to create win-win conditions, but you cannot make everyone happy. So you need to, let's say, take stock of the fact that, let's say, at the end of the project, some stakeholders might still be, let's say, grumpy or not happy with your project. Whatever the situation, whatever the case, in my opinion, an important guide is to never forget the project management principles, those of responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty, because these are principles which will help you move and manage and interact with stakeholders, of course, in, let's say, projects which are easy and in which the stakeholders are very supportive, but also situations in which the stakeholders may not be so positive about your project and your activity.
We do have a question from Amit. How do you manage a project team who are of low morale or interest?
Oh, that's a very good question. And well, of course, what I will try to do first thing first is to understand what are the main causes of the low morale and interest. So the first thing is understanding what is causing the bad, let's say, environment in your project. Of course, there might be external factors, or there might be internal factors. External factors could be the fact that, let's say, for instance, the team members are not paid enough, or they are put under, let's say, too much stress for tight deadlines. The internal factors could be a toxic environment with respect to the communication among the team. Maybe there is a prima donna who is taking all the, let's say, taking all the focus on the project, and is basically creating an environment which is not sane. And then once you understand what are the conditions which are causing the situation, it might be you actually, it might be the project manager causing the problem in the team. Once you create the environment which helps you collect information about what is causing let's say the situation, then you can take the actions which can help move out of the situation. In my experience, taking ideas from your team is a very good idea. Empowering your team is a very good idea. Stop micromanaging your team is a very good idea. These are all things that, let's say, can help. Of course, there are situations in which you have little control. For instance, if the deadlines are very tight, you can try and, let's say, change some of the conditions, or you can try and make the team understand that, let's say, that's the contingent situation. Once again, the suggestion is create an environment in which people can speak freely with, let's say, no risk of being punished or marked upon if they don't tell something you don't like to hear. Create this environment, listen to your team, take their suggestions, empower the team. And this is something I would try.
Thank you, Adolfo, so much for your time today, and thank everyone for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Susan.